So hello and good evening and good afternoon to folks who are here with us from the West Coast. Thank you all so much for joining us. I am Sydney McKinney, the Executive Director of the National Black Women's Justice Institute. And for those who are new to the organization, the National Black Women's Justice Institute, or NBWJI for short, is a nonprofit organization that researches, elevates, and educates the public about innovative, community-led solutions to end the criminalization of Black women and girls. We aim to dismantle the racist and patriarchal paradigm on which the US criminal legal system was founded and build in its place pathways to opportunities and healing. And we envision a society that respects, values, and honors the humanity of Black women and girls, takes accountability for the harm it has inflicted, and recognizes that real justice is healing. Earlier this year, NBWJI started a virtual book club focusing on books by Black women that show the real impact of criminalizing, punishing, and incarcerating Black women and girls. The third book we read was Talk With You Like a Woman by Dr. Cheryl Hicks, who is here with us this evening. This book and Dr. Hicks' work in general is an important reminder that the criminalization of Black women and girls has a long history. Working class and poor Black women and girls are being criminalized for the same things today as they were at the turn of the 20th century. Black women leading advocacy and developing programs for criminalized Black women and girls face the same obstacles today as they did in the early 1900s. And criminalized Black women and girls continue to fight for visibility, recognition, and to be heard, just as they did over 100 years ago. But the narratives she shares with us are not just of struggle. Her work elevates Black women and girls' resistance to the systems that sought to control them and deny them their freedom, which resonates with all of us who are in this work today. So I'm fangirling. I love Dr. Hicks. I think she's amazing. Dr. Hicks is an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware. Her research addresses the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and the law. And she specializes in late 19th and 20th century African American and American history, as well as urban, gender, and civil rights history. Before I jump into questions, I want to let folks know that we are monitoring the Q&A throughout, and we will do our best to bring your questions into the conversation in real time. That being said, we may not catch every question, so please, if we miss it, drop your question in the Q&A portion during the discussion tonight, and we'll do our best to get it answered. So Dr. Hicks, as you know, I think you're amazing. And it is such an honor to be here with you. I first discovered your work when I was a doctoral student, and at the time reading your scholarship just blew my mind. I was just struck by the similarities between what directly impacted women and girls' experience today and their experiences over 100 years ago. And I've told you this, but the lens through which I really view and understand the juvenile legal system and how I approach my work today is so largely influenced by the research you have done. So I just thank you so much, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with you tonight.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for the generous invitation, the generous introduction. And I've said it before, and I think it bears repeating, that I'm really quite honored to be here tonight. And I also am really grateful. I told you earlier that this book will be almost 11 years old at the end of this year. And I am really grateful that you find it to be useful in thinking about the contemporary issues of Black women and girls and gender nonconforming individuals as they continue to navigate between their families and their communities and the state. They're really navigating still, I think, their voice and their vision for their lives. And I feel like my research and writing with this book really helped me better understand the context of the contemporary moment, that the issues that I see publicized I can make connections. Oftentimes, I am sad to make connections to what I've studied 100 years ago. But I think that it also bears repeating or bears, saying that there's so many cases that haven't been uncovered. And so while there are some cases that are publicized, there are cases that are not publicized. And I'm just, again, thank you so much for asking me to be here to have this conversation about this really important issue.
Well, thank you. And you jumped off with, I think, such an important point, and so much of what kind of orients the work of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, which is there's so many Black women, girls, and gender nonconforming people's stories of police violence, of criminalization that are not elevated. We are doing our best to tell the stories that we learn about and we know about, but there is so much more work to be done because we are only getting the tip of the iceberg. And so I am so appreciative of your work because it reminds us that it's not new. What we're seeing, what we're experiencing today has a long, long history. And as important as it is that we elevate the stories of folks today who are impacted by the criminal legal system, it is equally as important that we elevate the stories of folks who were impacted 100 years ago. Their stories matter as well. So thank you again. I want to jump off with my first question, which is, what inspired you to study the lived experiences of working class Black women at the turn of the 20th century through this lens of their experiences with the criminal legal system?
So when I was a graduate student, I was studying migration and Black migration around the late 19th and early 20th century. And I was just really interested in finding out more about how, exploring more how working class and working poor Black women thought about and what they wanted for their lives. Like, how did they talk about their own lives? Because in that moment, it was very different. It was a very different kind of question than what the scholarship at that moment was focusing on. And that scholarship really focused on what social reformers and activists envisioned and deemed best for Black women and girls, right? So for me, my intention was to try to find their voices. And in order to kind of really do that, I had to really think about the available sources. And the group that I was looking at, they don't necessarily leave sources about their lives and their thoughts about their lives. So I had to really kind of think about the challenges they faced, and was there documentation of the challenges that they faced, and how might I find that? And so the criminal justice system in the late 19th and early 20th century was one of the ways that I believed that I could get to their voices. And so I was also interested in a range of experiences. So I wasn't just interested in young women, but I was interested in adult young girls, but adult women as well. And so I looked at two types of institutions as a result. So one, a reformatory that was really based on the idea of rehabilitating young women from 16 to 30 years old, and looking at those who were committed for misdemeanors. So prostitution, disorderly conduct, that kind of thing. But then I also looked at a woman's prison in Auburn. So the reformatory was Bedford, which is still in existence, and the prison was in Auburn, and both in New York. And this prison was not about rehabilitation, was really about incarceration and women who had been committed as felons. So I had a wide range of women and women's experiences to look at in terms of the sources. But one of the things that I felt was really important was how I was posing my questions. And so one of the questions that I thought about was, if you place these women at the center of a narrative about the urban North and New York, especially, what does that story look like? Is it the story that other scholars have written about? And if gender and a gendered perspective makes a difference, what kind of difference does it make? So that really led me to kind of think about method through those kinds of questions. But then if you are going to place those women at the center of the urban narrative, then what you are going to see is more of the problems that these women faced rather than how others saw them as the major problems within Black communities and families. So I switched it to kind of think like, what problems did they say that they had, as opposed to some of the literature of the time, which was like, there are too many young women in the city and they're causing all of these issues. Black women are the problems within Black communities. And so I think I also, so the title of the book itself, Talk With You Like a Woman, is based on that. And it stems from a portion of a letter that a Black woman wrote to prison officials about how they needed to respect her rather than ask her relatives if she was living up to parole regulations. And so Lucy Cox is the case where I get the title from the book. And I actually want to take some time to like read her words and a portion of that letter. And so here's a portion of it. So she begins by saying, "This is business. I want to talk with you like a woman. Dr. Baker," and that's the superintendent of Bedford, "tell your officers to stop, call up my sister concerning of me. I'm working for my living. I am my own woman. I live before so many women officers interfere in my business. I am working, I report, let hence wise be sufficient. I don't live on my sister, I living of myself." And so I use that as the title of that chapter on families and parole, because her words were so powerful to me and it uncovered so much and it was so rich. And I wrote the book because of women like Lucy Cox. And so getting at that voice is through a set of sources that are clearly problematic, and they're also based on conflict. But we also find that there were women who were voicing their ideas about how they should be treated and how they saw themselves.
That's so important and really resonates because it's the approach that National Black Women's Justice Institute takes as well, of trying our best as far as our research and our policy work goes to center and elevate the voices of directly impacted Black women and girls and listen to them and have them tell us, what should we be doing? What are the solutions? How do we end criminalization of Black women and girls? How do we transform the criminal legal system? What do you want and what do you need? And how do we be in service to you? And so I really appreciate that is the frame and wanting to elevate the stories in the way that you have done. And, you know, I appreciate you reading that portion because it is so powerful. It is so powerful to hear someone say, no, talk to me. I'm the one that you need to be talking to.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to talk to anyone else, me. And often, you know, we overlook, take people's agency away, particularly if they are directly impacted. There is this assumption that happens that, you know, they can't function independently. They can't, you know, they can't operate in the way that we would want them to, or whatever that means, but that's not true, right? And so I think it's just so important that the person that we are talking to, the person who we are looking to for solutions and answers, is the directly impacted person.
Yeah,
they know.
Definitely.
Thank you. Related to that, I wanted to ask you if you could talk to us a little bit about a constant theme that came up throughout the book was this idea of, and this concept of respectability. It is a really important concept as far as I think how, as you describe it in your work, the way in which the state kind of justifies its criminalization of Black women and girls, and rooting it in ideas that Black women and girls are not respectable, and therefore state intervention as far as policing and incarceration are justified. I feel like that concept of respectability is still something that is present today. It's not named respectability. That's not how people talk about it. But when we hear the stories about Black girls who are being policed and surveilled in schools, so much of it is rooted in this idea of not being respectable.
Right.
When women are in court, judges will look to their, past experiences, create these stories of how they are not respectable. Prosecutors will use this idea of this woman, this Black woman is not respectable, in her actions. And so therefore she needs the harshest sentence. So I think it comes up today, but we don't talk about it. And so I'm hoping you can, walk us through and tell us more about respectability as a concept and how it affected Black women and their treatment by the criminal legal system.
Okay. For me, it was really important for me to think about and try to historicize respectability through the lens of Black working class and working poor communities. So it's a really great question, because I think a lot of the ways in which we think about respectability is through racial uplift, and how the Black middle class is, trying to show the Black working class, how to be respectable and moral. And one of the things that I really attempted to do was to kind of show the complexity of working class and working poor communities, and the ways in which there was actual racial uplift within those working class and working poor communities, right? So one of the things that I was interested in was the relationship of the women that I was looking at to that term, and how it would have been understood in that moment, right? So the sources, showed me that working class and working poor communities believed in a strategy of what Evelyn Higginbotham has talked about as the politics of respectability. And it wasn't actually taught to them from, their middle class neighbors and those folks in the community, but they embraced it because it was a part of their worldview. It was a part, for them, they would define it as their work ethic, that they were law abiding, that they were church going. And, I think that some of us have heard examples of folks who would say, I may have only had 2 dresses, but when I presented myself, they were clean, they were pressed. Like, there was a real kind of sense of importance about respectability within working class and working poor communities that didn't necessarily always connect with what we think it is, which is social status in terms of money, in terms of education. Like, I was really interested in thinking about how they saw it. And because some of these women viewed themselves as respectable, that was important to me, right? And so Lucy Cox, who I got the title of the book from, she's like, I was arrested for prostitution. I made a mistake, but my parents didn't teach me that. Like, I made a mistake. And what she's really trying to say is that I paid for my mistake. I served my time, and I should be given another chance. So you don't need to ask other people about who I am, because I know the difference between right and wrong. I chose something else. And what I think her case shows us is the ways in which working class and working poor women, the mistakes they make, they get penalized from them doubly. It isn't a sense for like, give them a second chance. There was another woman who I always remember in the examples, and she was out with friends and she got caught up and she said, I should always remember my ABCs, and that is avoiding bad company. And I always remember that, because to me, that shows that she's acknowledging she made a mistake. And that doesn't mean that, there were women who, didn't necessarily see these kinds of ideals as important to them. But the fact that some did, I think, was important. And I think the one of the things that we might not always think about is the fact that a number of cases of the women that I found around disorderly conduct, when I actually looked at their cases, it was really that they felt like they were disrespected by plainclothes police officers. So they didn't know they were police officers, and these men would say really awful things to them, or would push them, and they saw themselves as defending themselves against plainclothes police officers because they were disrespected, and those officers basically saw their self-defense as criminal. So there are moments where I see cases where the women are in prison because they are defending themselves because they see themselves as respectable. But I also think that those women, I also have cases of women who are seen as respectable and are middle class. And one of the things that happens with them is that sometimes their cases get publicized. And they may not get the accountability they want, but they actually get publicized. So sometimes having more access and opportunity allows for, it doesn't mean that they don't, that they aren't violated. It means that they may have a different access to let people know about that. And I think, the ways in which these women are seen in the courts and seen once they're paroled, these cases show us that they're always being judged by a particular kind of ideal that some of them already have. And so that's what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to explore and historicize in the book, that there was a working class respectability that is already there, and it was in the sources, and that's what I talked about in terms of thinking about that. I hope I got
Really,
to like what you were.
you did, and I so appreciate it, because I think what you elevated is how their self-perception of their respectability was there. It was real. They felt like they were respectable, people, which they were. And yet they lived in an environment in a country where when you see Black people, like, they are automatically perceived as not being respectable. So you have these tension of like the meaning of respectability. There's the meaning that the person has created for themselves, which unfortunately in our society, being a Black woman, she still was not being seen as respectable, even when, her behaviors and actions by, norms of our society would have also been considered respectable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really interesting, because we do see this still playing out. Another thing that you just mentioned that I think is so important is Black women's interactions with police. And you actually wrote in June a post about Breonna Taylor and her killing by police. It is posted on the Association of Black Women Historians. I really encourage folks to check out their website. They have also some really amazing videos with Dr. Hicks and other historians talking about really important issues and talking about their work. We have just dropped some of that information in the chat. But Dr. Hicks posted a really wonderful piece talking about Breonna Taylor, and just placing the police violence that she experienced and her killing in this historical context. And in it, you wrote, Black women's history of police brutality provides crucial context for understanding gendered resistance, but also forces us to raise some painful questions. And you shared an example of Black women who experienced police violence and resisted and fought against it. And I just wanted to know, why do you think the long history of police violence against Black women has not gotten the attention it deserves? It didn't get the attention then, and it's not getting the attention now. So if you could, what are your thoughts about that?
So one, I think that Black women have always talked about it, what was happening to them. But I think it's important to think about who's listening, what they actually hear, and what kind of plan of action is going to happen to address the issue. And a lot of times the plan of action is to say, you young woman, you young girl need to change something about yourself so that you won't be perceived as a threat or dangerous or criminal, as opposed to, seeing a change or radical shift in the way that the police deal with Black women and girls when they perceive them or when they see them, in society. And so I think there are several things that we might think about this, frame it in several different ways. One, I think people might see as isolated incidents rather than how certain isolated incidents conform to a longer history. So I'm thinking of the example of Fannie Lou Hamer, whose birthday was yesterday, whose 1964 speech at the Democratic National Convention really spoke to police brutality within the prison, right? And so some people might see that as an isolated incident that doesn't conform to a longer history, but there are other ways that I think we don't actually see these kinds of things happening. We know Black women historians and historians who work on Black women's experiences have talked about that Fannie Lou Hamer's case, as horrific as it was not the only one during that period. And those cases are slowly being revealed. I also think that sometimes the violence that these women face gets subsumed with other types of politics. So the women that I discovered in the 19th century press were highlighted because of an issue of police violence and misconduct overall. So the press was really trying to just here's another case, and the next week it would be something else. And so they weren't really concerned about Black women being violated. They were concerned about just overall police conduct or misconduct, right? I also think that the long history of Black women's experience with police brutality gets subsumed under the support for Black men. So there's a way in which I talk about a riot that happens in 1900 in New York. And I talk about it through Arthur Harris and Mae Enoch, who were a couple who were out late at night. There was a heat wave, so being inside during that time it was unbearable. And so they're walking, he goes into a business, she's waiting for him outside. Again, a plainclothes police officer comes and believes that she's prostituted. She's just standing there. And so as he's about to arrest her, that's when Arthur Harris comes out of the business and believes a white man is manhandling his partner. The scholars who write about this and those who report on it during that moment, they see this as, and they talk about this as the right of a man to protect this woman from a plainclothes police officer and the need to support him, even though he didn't know it was a police officer. What we don't hear is how Mae Enoch is one case of many of women being harassed by the police. And she actually falls through the cracks. We know that she was arrested, but we don't know anything else about her. We don't know anything else about her and others who were brutalized in that same kind of moment. I also think that Black women's voices about their experiences aren't necessarily validated unless they have a kind of proximity to respectability. So there's a way in which, even though I talked before about, these women already seeing that they already understanding for themselves that they had respectability, there's also a way in which some women's, the proximity that they have to respectability is a way in which, again, May Enoch, that I talked about in the last example, people just don't want to kind of see her as a victim of police brutality. It's something that she must have did. They are more likely to listen to the women who wrote affidavits, who were seen as the wives of men, the sisters of men. And so their affidavits about how they were brutalized in the riot that happened after this altercation, that gets more attention. But even that isn't subsumed under Black women's experience with police brutality. And I also think that it's a hard thing to think about, but it's difficult to understand that those in power who don't care or don't care enough about this issue. And there's just not a level of concern about Black women and girls that we can kind of see this as a longstanding historical issue. And that's why that was really important for me to document and really talk about that, because it's there. Like, the evidence is there, but there isn't always a will for the folks who have the ability to make those changes to do that. And that's not to say that Black women's organizations haven't done enough and aren't doing enough. But I do think that the fact that Black women's voices are generally not listened to and not seen as legitimate plays a role in some of this.
Listening to you just describe why Black the police violence they experienced did not get the attention it deserved, you could be talking about today, like that is everything that you named as the reasons why the police violence and the harm that Black women experience at the hands of police does not get the attention is for all of those reasons. And I think, just an important reminder to me about why we need to read your book, right? This isn't new. We are just seeing it continue to play out. And there is a lot of work for us to do. And so I'm just so happy to be in community with you trying to make those changes. But it is eerie on some level, the consistency over 100 years and the lack of change that we have seen. Thank you. Another thing that you talked about in your book, and I think also comes out a little bit in the stories that you told about Black women who were being harassed by police, was that, they're being harassed for no reason. And one thing that comes out in this book is these laws that oddly still exist today around like wayward minor laws, incorrigibility. These are terms that, what do they even mean? And yet our juvenile legal system still incarcerates kids today for things like being wayward and being incorrigible, which just blows my mind, because they are today catch-all. Like, what is it? Disobedient, not listening to your parents. Like, what does this mean? And they still exist on the books. I will say, and I'm not sure if any of our friends from Girls from Gender Equity are here, but they did a lot of advocacy in New York State to get wayward out of the juvenile legal system as a category for bringing young people into the juvenile justice system. But this was a concept which you describe in the book that was largely created for girls and women. I was surprised to see that it wasn't until, I think you say 1924, when boys could be brought into the juvenile legal system for being wayward or incorrigible. Up until that time, for like the 20 plus years when we have the juvenile court system, it was primarily used for girls. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about wayward minor laws and incorrigibility, and what were some of those cases, because I think they will be incredibly helpful to us today in understanding why those kinds of categorizations and classifications and offenses should be removed from the books.
Yeah, I mean, if you would indulge me a little bit, I want to read a little bit from the law in 1920, and then talk about some of the kinds of laws that still connect to that. And so a portion of the law says in 1920, whenever a woman or girl of the age of 16 or over is found in a reputed house of prostitution or assignation, is found associating with vicious or dissolute persons, or is willfully disobedient to parent or guardian, she is in danger of becoming morally depraved. So these wayward minor laws, which expand to include truancy, expand to include breaking curfew, expand to include if you spend too much time with your boyfriend or your partner, or friends that are not deemed to be appropriate. That expands to include those young people who run away from home. That expands to include family members who say, this young child is unmanageable, and I'm going to go to the state to see how to make my home life better, but also to help to rehabilitate this child. And I think one of the larger questions is, why does this make sense, and why is it still here, right? And I think that people are conditioned to think that this is the right thing to do in a lot of ways. You don't have to really think about the structural problems in the home, in the school, in society, if the solution is to solve it with a law that says the problem can be, placed on these young girls, right? You don't have to think about why the particular behaviors seem criminal in the first place. If young girls with limited sources and opportunity, whether they make a mistake or whether their behavior is seen as criminal, can solve the kind of issues that you see going on in society. And it also raises this issue, that they're defined as criminal quite early, right? And what we know is that the behavior that I just talked about, the behavior that it becomes expansive and is still in the books, is not a behavior that other racial and ethnic groups don't participate in, and we don't see them, but they don't get policed and surveyed in the same way. And so I think there's a conditioning going on that communities across the board kind of say, yeah, this makes sense. We should, this is a way to help protect them. If we get them young, then they won't do this as adults. But what folks don't see is that they're already criminalized. They already have a record, and for behavior that is seen to be problematic and criminalized, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for folks who don't know, that in our country, we have these things called status offenses, and they are what Dr. Hicks named. They are young people can be brought into the juvenile legal system for being wayward, incorrigible, curfew violations, truancy, running away. And in 1996, with the Juvenile Justice Prevention Act, there was emphasis and encouragement that these young people should be diverted. But these young people still are brought into the juvenile legal system. Kids of color are more likely to be detained for these kinds of violations. And these are not criminal acts. These are just acts that are criminalized because of a young person's age. So, there's a lot of reform that needs to happen around the status offense system. And I find it so curious that for some reason, the gendered nature of this attempt to control girls is really kind of forgotten about. And I feel like if we remembered the origin of some of these classifications, like wayward and incorrigible, and how they are specifically about controlling the sexuality of girls or perceived kind of deviance of girls, maybe we would be trying to strike them down more quickly. And so I think it's so important to elevate how gendered so much of our status offense laws historically were and even today. And you also mentioned this in your book, and it still happens today, where parents will go to the juvenile court and say, basically, I need help, right? Like, I'm having trouble with Sydney. Can you help me? And can you take Sydney off my hands for a little bit? And what you describe in the book is, parents who saw it as their right to go to the court for help, right? Look to the state for assistance. And what the state did was actually remove their children and often did not give their children back to them within the time frames. And today we see that, where in New York they're called PINs, persons in need of supervision, and in other states they're called CHINs, children in need of supervision, and they're kids who are brought into the foster care system. And those are the young people who are most likely to age out of care without returning home, right? So we are setting these young people up for really difficult life situations, because we know that being impacted by foster care really has poor outcomes and negative impacts on people. So I really appreciate you lifting that up in the book. I think it just gets overlooked so often. We are close to, I'm going to open it up for questions, but while questions are coming in, I was super fascinated about Ms. Campbell, who you write about in chapter 5. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about Ms. Campbell. She seemed like, I was just so struck by the story and her perseverance and the kind of crazy espionage that was happening within this organization to get this Black woman who all she was trying to do was like divert, Black women and girls out of the criminal legal system. So hoping you can tell us a little bit about her.
I mean, I think Grace Campbell was a Black woman who was in New York, and I think her case gives us a sense for the kind of range of strategies that Black women employed in service of Black women and girls. So she gives us a sense for the way in which the reformers at that time looked at young women. Many other reformers wanted to use preventive sources. They wanted to protect them before they would, be incarcerated, if that ended up being the case. And so she came in under an organization called the National League for the Protection of Colored Girls, which that really is the organization that got me to do any of this work. Was I was trying to figure out who's trying to protect Black women at this particular moment. So she was one of the people who was a part of that organization. And what she saw was the fact that while preventive work was important, what she kept seeing was the fact that these young girls were actually being arrested and they were being incarcerated. And so one of the arguments that she made based on her experience was that the organization needed to actually have another set of activists to move into the criminal justice system. And the people who were her superiors basically decided that, yeah, we don't want to really listen to her. And they had her dismissed. They basically said, you know, she's out of line. We know what our objectives are. And what Campbell, what I loved about that case was that Campbell forced them to go public. Like they wanted to do it undercover to basically dismiss her and fire her. And she's like, no, you're gonna have to do it publicly. You're gonna have to tell people why. We will have evidence. That's how I found it. We have evidence of you doing this. But Campbell is also she knew that she had to learn the system because the girls were in the system. And so she trained to be a probation officer and a parole officer, because although those services were offered, white probation officers and white parole officers did not want to, at that time, go into Black communities. So if a woman was given probation, which meant that she would not have to be incarcerated, if there was no probation officer that would be willing to go in her community, she was incarcerated. So Campbell knew that this was a crucial issue that needed to be addressed. And she did work with the National Urban League to help train social workers, Black social workers for this. But then she also was an institution builder. She's like, if they're not doing it, I'm going to, basically have a home for young girls. It was still underfunded. It didn't address the huge need, but she gives us all kinds of ways to think about how Black women, trying to be advocates for Black women, are underfunded, not listened to, and they still attempt to do the work. Yeah.
Yeah, she's a great, just a great person to elevate, and she really resonated with me because I think what she went through is what women today who are doing this work, what Black women today who are doing this work, trying to support Black girls, trying to create diversion programs that are designed for Black girls are up against, right? And you make this point, but the lack of diversion programs was actually why so many more Black girls was one reason why more Black girls were being incarcerated than white girls, right? Because it was about what were the services that were available in the community. And I think that's an issue that we have today, right? Like that we do not have as many programs that are developed for Black girls by Black women from the communities that they come from. And judges will be like, all right, we don't know what's out there. So maybe detention is actually the right option, the option for this young person. And even today, Black girls account for a much larger percent. I think in 2017, they were 40% of all girls who were in youth detention. So, I think these same challenges around availability of services and the impact is still happening today. And just the fighting that Black women who do this work have to do to be seen, to have their work be validated and recognized, and fighting for funding, it's still a problem. We do have a question. Kenya Welch asks you, do you see a connection between the media's treatment of missing Black girls and the history of criminalization of Black girls?
Yes, I see the connection in part with the inability to want to see them at all, right? To see them as legitimate. I think the media is much more willing to see young Black girls as the problem, right? And so that gets elevated to the point where people have to protest and say, come on, like, can we talk about what's going on in their lives? But when it comes to the fact that Black women and girls are one of the largest groups of folks who are missing and folks can't find them, there is just, the media has no interest in diverting or putting attention onto that And it's a real crisis that there are so many of these young girls and women that are missing. They're simply missing, and that no one except for family members are looking at them. And you can see in many instances, family members and friends using social media for years to look for these young girls and women. But the latest case I think that we saw a couple of weeks ago, that was the major headline for this young woman who unfortunately was found murdered. But there's so many other cases. And so I do see connections in terms of the media is more willing to reinforce different kinds of stereotypes about these young girls instead of really looking for them and seeing them as worthy of looking for.
Thank you. We have a few moments left. I want to give folks a chance that if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. I just also want to say, like, thank you so much for sharing. There, like in the conclusion, I think it's in the conclusion chapter, you remind us that Ella Fitzgerald was actually in the New York Reformatory. And there's just this incredible quote from the, I think, superintendent, which is, all of the girls are Ella's. And this idea that every Black girl who is in here came from what Ella came from, but also has the opportunity and the potential to be Ella Fitzgerald, right? If nurtured and supported. And I think it's just such a really important message to kind of close the book out with, that when we are investing in Black girls, when we are trying to support Black girls, they have the potential to run the world and be superstars, literally.
Yeah.
And when we don't, they can be lost in this horrific and violent system. But every Black woman and girl who is incarcerated today, who has been impacted by the criminal legal system, is Ella Fitzgerald, right? And I thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I wanted to also kind of humanize and bring a connection to the women that I was talking about. Like, they don't have to be humanized; they're human, and I use what they said and what they did in order to reinforce that. But I think that for many people to know that someone as successful as Ella Fitzgerald was also in this cycle, I thought that was important to remind us of.
Yeah. So I appreciate you so much. And it is important to me that we wrap up on time because people have lives to get back to, and you have a lot of teaching and grading, I know, ahead of you. But I just wanted to say thank you so much. Like I said, I am just such a fan of your work. And it is just such an honor to be in conversation with you. And I told you this, my birthday is tomorrow, but like, this is the way that I want to spend the eve of my birthday, is talking about this with you, like just a person whose work has just inspired me so much. So thank you.
Yes,
so
happy birthday. Happy birthday. Wishing you all the best. And I think I saw somebody ask about the ABCs again, and like,
oh yeah,
it's just avoid bad company. That's what it means. Avoid bad company.
I love it.
So
Constance
thank you
says,
so
love
much.
it. Thank you.
I really, really enjoyed talking about making a connections. And it really, really, I think it's really useful, but it also reminds us that we still have so much work to do.
Yes, exactly. And so thank you so much for your work. I will continue to follow and be a fan and inspired. And I just appreciate all that you do. And I also just want to say thank you to all of the people who joined us this evening. You guys were wonderful. It's always great
Yes.
to be in community with you all. And before you jump off, a few things for you. If you haven't had the opportunity to read the book, read it. If you are a person who gets a little overwhelmed by books, we have copies of articles that we will be dropping in the chat. So you can check out 2 articles by Dr. Hicks that are basically chapters in the book. I think there's, so they're Google Scholar. That's how we got them. So they're free and publicly available. So we're dropping those in the chat for folks. And then we also want you to stay tuned. We haven't picked our next book yet, but when we do, we will let you know. If you have ideas, please let us know of books that we should include in our book club. And then the last thing I want to tell folks is we are having an event in 2 weeks on October 20th. Information just went in the chat. We are co-hosting a conversation with the Western area of the Links Incorporated. It is the first conversation in a series of conversations we are calling Let's Link Up. Your voice gives me strength. In our first conversation, we will be talking about the importance of culturally and gender affirming mental health services for Black women and girls. So more information about that is to come. So check your emails. And I just want to thank everyone. This was so much fun. And Dr. Hicks,
Thank you, Dr. Sydney, and thank everybody for taking time out of your schedule to be here. You could be any other place, and I just appreciate you taking the time to engage with us, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.